speaker, Dr. Richard Gray. Dr. Gray is a professor at the University of Saskatchewan, where he holds the prestigious Canadian Grain Policy Chair in the College of Agriculture and Bioresources. He earned his PhD in Agriculture and Resource Economics from the University of California at Berkeley, and has since built a renowned career focusing on ag economics, specifically in areas like grain transportation and ag innovation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gray.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. Does the mic sound all right? We're good? Okay, thanks. So today, the topic on my presentation is rebalancing the priorities for the 2028 Agricultural Policy Framework, and looking at BRMs and research together. The Agricultural Policy Framework has been around for decades, and every 5 years the federal, provincial, and territorial governments get together and jointly agree on a new framework. The Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership Agreement expires in 28, and there will be a new one that replaces it. And in the past agreements, government agreed to spend about $3 billion on BRMs and research. One of the reasons I'm bringing up research is that on January 23rd, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada announced cuts to many of the research programs, closure of stations, etc. So it's pretty clear that the federal government continues to be bent on reducing research expenditures over time. And this is the year where this July they're going to set the agenda for next year's APF framework, which will then set the agenda after 28. So now is the right time to have input into that APF. And I think producers need to have a voice in that and squarely think of research as well as BRMs within this package. I think I've timed my presentation appropriately, but just in case I don't get there, I'm going to give you my conclusion before. How do I go back here? This way? I'm going to give you my conclusion before I do that. And I've studied BRMs for years. As an economist, I was a farmer in the early 80s, and my son became a farmer. I then became a crop share landlord, and then my son took over farming in 2008. So I've been involved as a producer for years, and both as an economist and a producer, I think it's important to think about agricultural research. And my conclusion is that it's in the producer's interest and in the national interest to do some reallocation within the agricultural policy framework. I'm going to start out with a little bit of a history lesson. I thought at one time I had to read agricultural policy history. I'm at the stage in my career where I've lived a lot of it, so I can narrate it pretty clearly. Context really matters. This framework got set up at a very different period in time. And I'm going to try to quantify some of the benefits and costs of agri-insurance, agri-stability, agri-invest, and agricultural research. Then I'm going to explore some of the economic impact of some possible reallocations within the APF, and then conclude. The 1980s were a very tough time for agriculture. High interest rates, low prices. It's a bit scary to be talking about this right now because what predated the 1980s was a grain price shock followed by an energy price shock, which created stagflation, which created inflation and high interest rates. In the 1980s, They used high interest rates to control inflation. That resulted in low commodity prices and certainly large payments that producers had to make. Farm bankruptcies followed that. And without government support, there would have been a lot more bankruptcies. Bankruptcies are a legitimate reason for intervention because they spill over from the firms that are going bankrupt to the producers going bankrupt to the local communities, creates contagion within the economy, and something needs to be done when there's a major economic crisis in the sector. So bankruptcies was one of the reasons why governments intervened, and they'd had a decade of intervention during the 1980s. I worked for the provincial government, believe it or not, during the early 1980s when there was a new program a year coming out. Many countries scrambled to assist their producers with price support measures. And as a result of these price supports, the markets didn't correct themselves. Producers continued to grow grain, even though the world didn't, demand wasn't sufficient for it. Prices stayed low for most of the 80s. And those low prices made farmers very dependent on government support. This is a graph of net farm income, the red line, and government payments. And during the 1980s, there were several years where farm income would have been negative without support payments. So we're going to talk about 1991, which was the end of that decade, was when the agricultural policy, the roots of the agricultural policy framework were created. The other thing that people would like to forget, but if you adjust for inflation, between 1981 and 1991, land prices fell by 59% in Saskatchewan. If you account for inflation. In nominal terms, they were down about 15% or so. Very, very tough time. Farm balance sheets were a mess and incomes were low. Very tough time. The Farm Income Protection Act was passed in 1991 by the federal government. It set up a framework for negotiating federal, provincial, territorial agreements. It also created an architecture to make farm policies consistent with the WTO agreement. And the WTO agreement for agriculture was very much trying to get out of this cycle of all the countries supporting prices too much, and as a result, perpetuating the glut, if you like. The FIPA Act also allowed for many of the programs that we have today. The Net Income Stabilization Account is currently the Agri-Invest program. There was a gross revenue insurance program. There's a version of that still operating in Quebec. There was a net revenue insurance program provided for. The closest thing we have to agri-stability was the CASE program created in 2003 as a result of it was sort of triggered by the BSE crisis, and then of course crop insurance is part of this package as well. So this architecture got set up in 1991, very different conditions that we have today. Since then, we can see a very, very different situation. From those low prices, in today's dollars, those land prices were about $500 an acre. They've gone up to over $2,500 an acre. About 5 times appreciation. In the last decade, we've seen a doubling of land prices again. Very, very different situation for agriculture than was in 1991, yet the farm programs haven't changed. They're very similar to what they were in 1991. Is there a need to rebalance what we should be looking at? So with that, when FIPA was created, it was there for income transfers, income stability, and preventing bankruptcies. What are the drivers today? It's pretty hard to argue agriculture generally needs an income transfer. It's also hard to argue that it's preventing bankruptcies in the current situation. There's lots of equity on most farm balance sheets. There's still a role there in income stability, and obviously, if there's another huge crisis in the markets at some point, they're there for those kind of reasons. But it's not certainly an income transfer type of justification that I think right now. I'm going to switch now thinking about the benefits and costs of different components of agricultural support. Agri-stability, agri-invest, agri-insurance, just agri-recovery is on here. I'm not going to mention it much other than to say that agri-recovery is there when a natural disaster takes out farm assets, and it's a useful program, so I'm not even going to discuss that. I'm going to talk about crop breeding and other agricultural research as well. Agri-stability costs between $200 and $400 million a year. They're budgeting about $400 million right now. About 20% of that is admin costs. It's fairly, if you know the paperwork involved in agri-stability, you can understand that happens at both ends. There's a lot of administration costs. The payments in that program are based on your current margin, the margin for the current year, which is gross income minus allowable cost expenses. In 2026, the agri-stability program basically pays 80% of the deficit when the current margin, this year's margin, falls below the 5-year average or Olympic average of your previous gross margin. There's no premiums for agri-stability, unlike crop insurance. But the idea was that partial payment, when it does trigger a payout, was in lieu of having to pay premiums. So that normally sit at 70%, now it's at 80%. So that's why there's no premiums for that program. Roughly 50% of producers participate in agri-stability. And that's despite very low entry fees, if you like, to get into it. Administration costs are certainly there for producers. But it suggests that this isn't a really highly valued program by most producers, or at least many producers, but a major crisis obviously could change this significantly. Does agri-stability really address market failures? I mean, governments are there when there's a market failure, and I would argue that normal price instability can be managed by producers through forward pricing, delayed capital replacement, rent versus own, crop share rentals, etc. Producers are used to managing those fluctuations. Again, could do that even without this program in place. There's no simple alternatives for, other than having a lot of equity to protect against major multi-year events. If you think about the BSE crisis that persisted for a few years, if you think about the trade war that happened during the 1980s, those things can happen for decades. Pretty hard to hedge against that. So I think at some modest level, there is a market failure there. And the benefit costs, the dollars putting in versus the value of those dollars going out, is probably about 1-to-1 ratio. It's got some value, but not an exceptional value as a program, certainly in the current conditions. Agri-invest, if you're a producer, you're probably in this program. Agri-invest costs the governments jointly about $200 million a year. It's pretty efficiently delivered. About 5% of that is admin costs. Government will match the first 1% of each producer's gross income, put in a savings account to a maximum of $10,000. It's very popular, 90% participation rate. Does it really address a market failure? First of all, many producers use AgriVest as a savings account, almost a retirement savings account. There's about $2 billion in that account. Withdrawals are typically not used, even though you're triggering other payments. Producers typically don't draw down the money at that time. They've either drawn it down regularly to reinvest it or spend on other things. And there may be other vehicles that are better equipped for retirement, like RSPs, tax-free savings accounts, and buying stocks and bonds rather than a savings account. So there are market alternatives, and given the current wealth within the sector, it's no longer an argument for income support from this. I don't think AgriInvest does invest. I don't think there's a market failure there, and I think as a result, even though those dollars flow fairly efficiently to producers, I think at best it's about a 0.8 to 1 benefit cost ratio. Costs money to raise those tax dollars. There's admin costs on the other end, and it ties producers' money up in savings account where it might be better used in other ways. So I don't think the benefit cost ratio is 1 to 1. I think it's less than that. Agri-insurance, the costs have gone up as a result of the more recent drought, but just about $1 billion a year. About 10% admin costs, a little bit lower than that in Saskatchewan. In this program, producers they pay a premium to purchase yield insurance equal to 60, 70, or 80% of the long-term average yield. They pay about 40% of the premium cost. The other 60% is split between the federal and provincial governments. And individual premiums are adjusted over time according to claim history and the risk area experience. Does agri-insurance address a market failure? Well, it's true if you look throughout the world, there's no all-risk crop insurance offered by the private market without a subsidy in any country that I've seen, and I've looked several times. So from that, you could say, well, it doesn't exist in the market. But what if there was insurance and producers had to pay actuarially sound premiums, the full premium costs? Would producers buy that insurance, or would it be considered too expensive to participate? And I'm not sure about that answer. I would think that certainly the higher levels of insurance probably not affordable, perhaps lower. There may be some value, but probably not. There is a role for crop insurance in the sense that the fund smooths expenditures for governments and for producers, in the sense that when there is a major drought, you can pay out $2 or $3 billion without having a huge spike in government costs or producer costs at that time. So it's one of those programs that sort of smooths income, and that may have some public external role. So I'm going to say that there's some, at least a modest, at least at a modest level, agri-insurance provides some role. So it has a benefit cost ratio somewhere around 1. That it has some value, but there are some alternatives as well. If we then look at agronomic crop research and crop breeding, I could look at livestock, I could look at food research and other things. I'm going to constrain it to there because my expertise is more in this area. Certainly the Government of Canada, the provincial government, producers, private sector are involved in funding agricultural research in the country. The agricultural policy framework includes funding for research. Agriculture Canada and Industry Canada also fund agricultural research outside of the APF. And I believe that research should be moved up in the list of APF deliberations. That's why I'm bringing it up here. My colleague Julian Alston in Davis, California, referred to agricultural research as slow magic. And it's partly because it acts slowly, but it persists for a long time, and it accumulates the knowledge of research. And so it's deceptively hard to value, but the value is tremendous over time. Long periods of sustained investment. Each year there's knowledge created. That knowledge has value, and that value persists for decades. So if you get say a 1% increase in productivity, the next year you get an increase on top of that and on top of that. So it accumulates over time. If we look at multi-factor productivity growth, this is old. The reason it isn't updated is because there's no really good estimates of this anymore, especially if you want to break it out by crops. But agricultural productivity growth is basically, productivity is the, basically it's the ratio of the quantity of outputs you produce compared to the inputs that are put into agriculture, both indexed by prices. And in Canada, between 1940 and this would be 2012, there'd been a 5-fold increase in productivity over time. Farms are way more productive, far less labor, far less energy, far more output per unit of land, and producers know that productivity has increased over time. If we look at the benefits and costs of research, remember I was talking about BRMs being around 1 or a little bit less, you get a very different story when you look at agriculture research. There's been lots of international studies. That global meta study at the top there looked at 2,600 different studies around the world that have looked at returns to agricultural research with an average 59-to-1 benefit cost ratio. The second one looked at U.S. State agriculture and federal agricultural research in the U.S. from 1850 until I think it was about 2010, and they came up with a 32-to-1 benefit cost ratio over that long period of time across all types of public agricultural research. I've been involved in several studies. More recent one with Katrina Bullock, 35-to-1 benefit cost ratio for wheat. There's been studies that have looked at wheat and pulses. I've looked at them as well, but well above 1, more like 30-to-1 or higher. Zero tillage, huge success story. For not a lot of investment in research, huge returns for the sector. The other one's barley, smaller crops as well. I'm involved in a number of studies looking at agronomic research and things, for example, like the insect pesticide, the insect maps, huge returns to producers by knowing what your threat levels are. So I think there's a lot of history on high returns to agricultural research. This is a graph from the Bullock and Gray. The red line is the expenditures that have gone into wheat research over time, and the blue areas are the returns that have been realized from that research. Again, one of the tricky parts about research is that if you stop research today, you still have much higher yielding varieties than you would have had if you hadn't invested in research, and those varieties are going to be able to be used in the future, going to be able to be built on. So the benefit stream goes way off into the future whenever you're looking at research. A more recent example, and maybe easier to relate to, I looked at the last decade of genetic wheat improvement in Western Canada, and I compared that to the investments in wheat breeding that occurred in the previous decade. Basically, in that previous decade, there was about 63 cents an acre put into wheat breeding during that decade. And that 4% yield increase results in a benefit of about $16 an acre going forward. Doesn't sound like very much, but if you add that up and take a present value, that $16 an acre, even after you account for the time value of money, the breeding investment costs go up a little bit. Some over a decade, it's about $1 an acre, or $260 million. But that $260 million worth of investment created $7.8 billion worth of benefits. About $160 an acre have already been realized by producers, and the other 140 will be realized because those higher yields are going forward. So these are big numbers, and I think most producers on their farms would say they probably have a variety on their farm today that yields 4% higher than what it was a decade ago. So varieties have improved, and they continue to improve over time. There's a lot at stake here in terms of research benefits. If you look at over time, the agricultural sector's been increasing productivity at 2 or 3% a year, but if you take just 2%, you take a conservative estimate of its value, that 2% a year has a benefit of about $12 billion in additional benefits per year of investment. And if you look just at genetic yield increase, you're still at $1.2 billion a year comes out of those research programs. It's very important for the long-run profitability of the sector. Despite all those international studies and years of study that have said the same thing, the research intensity in Western Canada in Canada generally has gone way down. In the 80s, it was about 5% of gross sales. Now it's about 1.5% of gross sales. It's certainly decreased over time, and the announcements in January will one more example of that reduction in support. There's several studies that have been documented this, including the Agriculture Institute of Canada, Farm Credit Canada, et cetera. You can look at if you want more data on that. Okay, so we've got very different pictures here, and I've tried to discuss a little bit about benefit cost, but this is what it means in aggregate. The red bars are the costs of the different programs. We've got agri-recovery, agri-invest, agri-stability, and agri-insurance, and they have close to a 1-to-1 benefit cost ratio. So the green bars on the left are a little bit shorter than the red bars on the right, but most of our costs are going into those programs. And if you look at the benefits from crop research and from breeding, you get small expenditures, but because of the high benefit cost ratios, large returns to producers. I'm just trying to see if I missed a slide here. Okay. So BRMs currently take most of the budget and have low benefit cost ratios. And if governments really want to enhance productivity, governments want to enhance productivity, but they're not investing in the high return activities. They're investing their money in BRMs. And I think that's partly because of the structure of the APF. You get together, what do you discuss? Well, what we funded last time, and you continue to fund what you did last time rather than really look at rebalancing it seriously. And the big expenditure items are always at the top of the agenda rather than maybe the most important pieces. I would argue productivity growth is the most important strategy a producer can have to ensure viability in the long run of their farm. And that would include environmental sustainability. And I think producers need to speak up about that. So if you think about options for rebalancing it, there's many different programs that could be used. One would be you could reduce the level of support in crop insurance or agri-stability, or I'm picking on agri-invest here. If $100 million is reallocated from agri-invest, and my favorite idea is just say, okay, let's just take that from the grain farmers, but we'll put it back in crop research. And I like the idea of using that agri-invest, instead of matching farmers' savings accounts, match producer levies. And that would attract producer money into that, more private money into research that then they can use to support all sorts of other research activities in a way that benefits producers. It would attract additional advantage. It would give producers a larger voice in research, and decisions wouldn't be made in Ottawa. And it would increase productivity growth by $2 to $3 billion a year. That's what that graph would look like. You can't even see the difference on the cost side, but the benefit side changes enormously. So in summary, and I did have a nice pie chart talking about the expenditures, but BRM's costs dominate the agriculture policy framework expenditures. They're most of the costs. The BRMs were created in 1991 in very different situations. BRMs have a low benefit cost or a modest benefit cost ratio, close to 1. Historically, breeding, crops research, agronomics have had high benefit cost ratios. And despite the record, the government's been reducing their support. I think the way to increase that support is put it within the agricultural policy framework in a rebalanced format. And that could increase productivity growth, making producers and the country better off. That's the argument I'm putting forward. Producers obviously have to engage with your organizations, figure what you want to do. But from my perspective, this makes a whole lot of sense. I wish you success in your deliberations, and I'll certainly take questions. Thank you.
I beat Rob. So great presentation. Thank you very much, Dr. Gray. Got a quick question though regarding the impact of the public's trust on actually moving ahead with this. So Clinton Monchuk, Farm and Food Care, Saskatchewan. My comment is when we invest in this research, and some of it's straight line, like you said, in terms of increasing yield, but we're getting to that plateau where it requires new science to push it forward. Mm-hmm. Have you done any research that looks at, in the event the public doesn't approve some of these new processes or the new science going forward, what effects that can have as well? Because I think some of this comes hand in hand moving forward, but I'd like your opinion on it.
I agree that there are some technologies that, frankly, the public doesn't understand, so they're wary of them, and there's, that's been a debate that's happened for a long time. There is a lot of upstream research that's absolutely risk-free. For example, understanding what the genome is and genetic markers and using other genomic tools for breeding. No one's arguing whether that's a good idea or not. It certainly is as safe as conventional breeding. It's just faster and more efficient. There's a lot that can be done just by taking our breeding programs back to where they were 15 years ago even, in terms of number of plots, et cetera. We should be expanding those programs, and we should have the resources to do that. So it isn't necessarily a change in what we do, but obviously there's always a cautionary tale about introducing something that your customers don't want. So I think producers are alert enough to understand that that would be the case, and the louder voice, the larger their voice, the more likely that I think that'll be covered off in what they do going forward.
Thanks, Dr. Gray. Rob Stone, a director with Sask-Wheat, and I farm at Davidson. Comment and a question, I guess. One, the comment is, should we be expanding our thought beyond research into the whole kind of ecosystem as far as market development and everything on the other sides of being able to market and transport the grain that we are growing more of on our farms? And the question I have as well is, we seem to have a terrible history of cutting research. And so if we move money for programs that in business risk management into research, what's to say in the future that we're not just going to cut that? And I guess what sort of protections or advice would you give if this is a way forward for it to ensure that that continues to stay invested in research?
I'll address your second and first, Rob. I think one thing that in Australia, they have a very sustainable system, and they do that because the industry is ponying up basically a large amount of money that's matched by the federal government. and there's widespread support for that amongst producers and amongst the government to maintain that system. So obviously there's going to be scrutiny, but it shouldn't be just a line item in, by putting it in the APF, for example, is a way that sort of enshrines it at least for the next 5 years. And as long as producers can see the return to those investments, and it's, I would say, spend even more time evaluating, making sure that you can document what has been achieved, but then I think there will be continued support for that. But to the extent possible, institutionalize it with sort of rules that this sort of program that's perhaps more general than just crop research. You can use it in Australia. The Primary Industries and Development Act matches research contributions in about 7 different sectors. So it could be very broad as well. So I think that would help as well to make that more institutional, if you like. And it's really important to emphasize that the match from producers is private money. I think that's essential as well. The government keeps saying, let's privatize research. It doesn't seem to matter how much producers put in. They still think that isn't private somehow. It is. So I think in Australia, it's certainly, that's private research in their accounting. So that's my thoughts on that, Rob. Question? Yeah.
Hi, Ernie Hall, 308. Just kind of a grassroots kind of a question, but what would we have a benefit if SaskAg stepped into Ag Canada's role in the research stations and maybe I guess put them into the university blanket, research blankets?
That's a really good question. I think it's absolutely essential that breeding takes place and is tested with plots at numerous plots across Western Canada. The semi-arid wheat breeding program out of Swift Current is a perfect example of that. It's the program that produced Brandon wheat and Carberry and Starbuck. Over 80% of the varieties have been successful coming out of that program. Those varieties were grown simultaneously and tested early in the breeding process at Indian Head, at Regina, at Swift Current. So if Ag Canada says we don't want to operate those research stations, they should still continue to operate, whether that's through the provincial government, which is certainly something that the provincial government, if they're required to step in, that would be certainly a viable thing to do. But I think it's essential that these representative sites that were chosen for a reason continue to operate and produce knowledge going forward. You cannot do all the breeding in a greenhouse. The breeding the big part of breeding is actually seeing how it does in the environment, in multiple environments in any given year. So I think it's really important to maintain these sites, and if that requires provincial government, absolutely. Questions? One more. Oh, Jim, you're not on. Is that intentional? Yeah. I think it's on now, Jim. Try it.
Dr. Gray, the research information and the costing, that includes all private research by chemical companies?
No, it doesn't, Jim, but I'm not including that 2% increase in productivity. If I was, the benefits would be far larger as well. I'm just talking about the genetic yield gain that comes from the breeding programs. If you want to include the agronomic benefits that come from private research in both in the chemical and the mechanical side, you would have benefits far larger than what I put down there. The benefit cost ratio probably wouldn't change all that much. It would just be much bigger numbers than what I put forward. So even the genetic gains alone, yield gains alone, are worth billions. If you take disease resistance that also comes from genetics, that should be added as well. So there's billions that come out of genetics and breeding alone. If we add to that what's happening on the chemical side, what's happening on the machinery side, what's happening on the agronomic side, those numbers get much bigger, but the benefit cost ratio doesn't change that much.
Thank you.
Dr. Gray, thank you very much for coming here. Really appreciate it.
Oh,
So sorry, I really apologize. We have very
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So with that, I must apologize. One of the worst jobs of the chair is to be the timekeeper. I really don't like cutting people off. I always really enjoy very good discussion. I would encourage anyone here that has any questions for any of our